Well, it is 3:01, so I might get started today. So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on universal and inclusive engagement. My name is Kate Symons. I'm the Chairperson of the Essential Services Commission. To start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land I'm hosting this webinar on, the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I also acknowledge the traditional owners of the various lands you are working on and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples participating today. I pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, and the elders from other communities who may be here today. Well, today is an exciting milestone. We are releasing the guidance paper we've received on universal and inclusive engagement, which is a key part of our work in developing our consumer vulnerability strategy. The Commission has always had a long-standing commitment to addressing consumer vulnerability, but at the end of 2019, we identified this area of work as a priority for us and in need of further examination. Officially launched in September last year, the strategy is set to give the Commission a pathway for consistent, coordinated and long-term approaches to addressing consumer vulnerability across our regulatory functions. So after months of engagement, research and development, the strategy draft is set for release in April, with the final strategy to be released on 30 June. Developed in partnership with the University of Melbourne Social Equity Institute, the guidance is a practical tool for universal engagement for regulators, but equally applies to businesses and organisations across sectors. Today, we will hear from Dr Yvette Maker and Research Fellow Nina Hudson, who will present on this work shortly. I hope you find today's webinar useful and that the principles and actions outlined in the paper will be used by all of us to shape our engagement practice and help us work towards truly inclusive engagement design. Today, we will also provide reflections from our community panel process, which was run in partnership with Mendelson Consulting. We will be hearing from some of our panel members in the form of a video on their reflections of the process. And Desley Renton from Mendelson Consulting will be a part of our panel later on as well. I'd like to just first introduce our guest speakers and panellists who have generously given their time to join us in discussion today. As I go around our virtual room, could you please put your camera on it and give us a wave as well? Dr Yvette Maker and Research Fellow Nina Hudson from the University of Melbourne Social Equity Institute. And Desley Renton from Mendelson Consulting, who along with Nicola Mendelson managed the community panel for the Commission. I would also like to introduce my fellow Commissioner Simon Corden, who will be facilitating our panel discussion today. Simon is the sponsoring Commissioner for this work and will also share some of his insights from his involvement in the community panel and the development of the vulnerability strategy. I believe I'm also joined by my fellow Commissioner Satish Bajani and members of the Commission's executive and staff. I would also like to acknowledge everyone listening in today. I understand we have well over 100 people attending this launch, so thank you very much for your interest. And also welcoming attendees to today's webinar. It's wonderful to see so many people here today, including attendees from the Energy and Water Ombudsman Victoria, the Australian Securities and Investments Commission, the Australian Energy Regulator, Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning, the Department of Health and Human Services, members of the community health sector, and I understand representatives from energy and water businesses. It's wonderful to see you all here and I hope you find today useful. In a moment, I will hand over to Yvette and Nina to present on the guidance paper. Before I do so, I'd just like to start with some quick housekeeping. Please note we're recording today's webinar. We will make the video available for you to watch after the event. We will be having a panel discussion in the later part of today, at which point we'll be using Slido. The details are on the slide being shared now, I believe, and will also be shared in the Zoom chat. So if you have any questions throughout today's discussion, please feel free to put them in there. We will get around to as many questions as we can during the session today. If we don't get to yours, please be assured we will certainly try to respond via our wrap-up email in the next few days. Well, as I said earlier, we're lucky enough to have with us today Dr Yvette Maker and Research Fellow Nina Hudson, who led the research and work on the guidance on universal engagement. Yvette is a Senior Research Associate at the University of Melbourne Social Equity Institute. She has a background in law and social policy and has worked on several better practice projects Yvette has worked with the Commission previously, and prior to leading this work on developing a guidance for universal and inclusive engagement, she worked with us in creating an easy English guidance and templates for the water sector, and has previously presented on better practice communication with consumers with cognitive disabilities at a Commission workshop in 2019. Nina Hudson is a research fellow at the Social Equity Institute and has over 15 years of law, legal policy and law reform experience. She's also conducting doctoral research on sentencing approaches for matters involving family violence in Tasmanian and Victorian courts. So I would now like to hand over to Yvette and Nina to discuss the report's findings and outcomes. There will be a short session available for questions after Yvette and Nina's presentation, as well as the panel session later. So if you have any questions in the meanwhile, feel free to place them on Slido. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Kate, and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I also live and work on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, and I pay respect to their elders past and present, and to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people on the line today. As Kate mentioned, Nina and I are part of a team, along with our colleague, Professor Bernadette McSherry, who were commissioned by the Essential Services Commission to look at guidance that's already available and then develop a set of principles to inform sensitive and appropriate engagement by regulators with consumers generally, and specifically with consumers experiencing vulnerability. And by way of background, there are a couple of trends or developments that guided the approach we took and the questions that we asked in conducting this project. The first, which many of you will be familiar with, is a growing focus on consumer vulnerability as a complex and flexible phenomenon that requires a coordinated response. And that's only been further confirmed and emphasised by recent global and local events, including the COVID-19 pandemic and the bushfires of 2019-20. And then associated with this is an awareness that engagement directly with consumers experiencing vulnerability and those who represent or work with them is necessary for understanding and responding comprehensively to that vulnerability and more generally to making sound evidence-based regulatory decisions. But alongside these factors is also an awareness that current approaches to engagement are often based on an assumed active consumer who's engaged with the market and has the resources to participate in engagement processes. And in consequence, engagement processes for stakeholders generally aren't designed to ensure that all consumer perspectives are heard and considered. And so on that basis, it's timely to focus on what inclusive consumer engagement looks like and how it can be achieved. So the report that we're launching today is in 5 sections, which comprises an introduction and 4 substantive sections. And today, Nina and I will speak for about 15 or 20 minutes on the main elements of the report. First, we look at the rationales for regulator engagement with consumers generally and consumers experiencing vulnerability specifically, and that corresponds to sections 2 and 3 of the report. And then we look at existing guidance on how regulators should engage with a wide range of consumers and community members. And that's guidance that's been published by regulators, government bodies, researchers, and community and consultancy organisations. And this is section 4 of the report. And then thirdly, we describe the 10 principles for consumer engagement that we've developed based on this guidance in section 5 of the report. And then we'll have a little bit of time for questions or comments at the end, and then some more time during the panel discussion later on.
Now it's my turn to chime in. Hi, everyone. I'm actually joining you from the land of the Kaurna people. I'd like to pay my respects to elders of this land and all elders joining us today. So I'm going to take you through what we looked at in terms of the rationale and existing guidance on consumer engagement in the regulatory context, and also some of the benefits that and purposes that we looked at. So we use a broad term of consumer engagement. That's referring to the practice of bringing the voices of the community into decisions that affect them, impact or interest them. So in the report, thinking about this in the regulatory context, we reviewed and synthesised research looking not just at the nature of regulation and its ideas and values and how these have changed, but also within that, the purposes and benefits of consumer engagement and how that may have changed over that same time as ideas about regulatory concepts are changing. So one of the key things we found in the research that we looked at that's consistently being identified is the idea of the importance of effective consumer engagement, because it properly reflects the public participatory dimensions of regulatory processes. So this is one of the broad rationales for consumer engagement by regulators, because regulatory processes and policies affect the entire community. So regulatory issues, decisions and processes can affect or be of interest to both current consumers or consumers in a particular market, as well as having a broader significance for the community generally. And this is a really important point, that this needs to be understood and factored into regulatory processes. And this is where consumer engagement comes into it. So we then looked at the range of purposes and benefits that consumer engagement have been found to have in the research. And we looked at a number of these, and we give a lot more detail about these in the report. But essentially, some of the key points are that it's really important. Consumer engagement is really important in terms of establishing and maintaining the regulator's legitimacy by being responsive to consumers. And this is about regulators achieving their fundamental objectives in relation to interests and well-being. For example, the Essential Services Commission has a legislative objective to promote the long-term interests of Victorian consumers. And this idea about legitimacy is also about increasing citizen empowerment and involvement. And this is a focus that's been observed in other policy areas as well, that sort of idea of bringing the community more generally into decision-making that affects them. And another idea in terms of the purposes and benefits of consumer engagement is about demonstrating accountability, and regulators being able to demonstrate this through the genuine involvement of consumers in decision making. And this ties into some of the ideas we talk about later in the report about transparency as well. And then finally, the last purpose or benefit of consumer engagement is about recognising the diversity of consumer experiences and needs, and making sure that the evidence base for regulatory decision making reflects this. And this is tied in with the idea that decision making is sound when it reflects consumer diversity and experiences and needs. And then the last point sort of that ties all of this together is about this idea of the consumer focus and what is good evidence for sound regulatory decision making. And this is all about this idea that the consumer focus is considered to be the primary driver of good evidence that should drive regulatory decision making. And so when you have a diversity in the community of consumers where the regulation is functioning, this needs to be reflected in your approach to engagement. And this is where, again, the principles come into it that we talk about later in the report. So as Yvette mentioned earlier, achieving these purposes in a manner that involves a full range of consumer perspectives, and crucially that captures the issues relating to consumer vulnerability, is likely to require some adjustment to standard stakeholder engagement practice. And this is an important point because it reflects the growing realisation that perhaps in the past, engagement has tended to focus on industry and professional stakeholders while keeping the community at a certain distance or an arm's length. And that's where consumers have, not all consumers have necessarily been well served by traditional approaches. So this idea to bring them in more. So the main purpose with the study and the report that we produced was to look at what such inclusive or accessible consumer engagement looks like and how it could be put into practice. We began by looking at existing research and other publications on regulators' engagement with consumers generally and consumers experiencing vulnerability. And our focus really was on the guidance that's offered by these sources on how to best to do this in practice. So we looked at discussion papers, strategies, research reports and journal articles. And these were mainly published in Australia and in the UK, where there's been more work done on this topic.
We found only a very small number of documents focusing specifically on essential services regulators' engagement with consumers, and none that looked in detail at engagement in this context with consumers experiencing vulnerability. And this possibly relates to the fact that it's proven difficult to operationalise a broad and encompassing definition of consumer vulnerability. So for this reason, we cast the net wider and included documents on consumer or community engagement by public bodies more generally, and especially documents that talked about engagement with particular populations or consumer groups who might not be well served by existing approaches, as well as some literature that talked about vulnerable or hard to reach groups. And this sort of engagement is most commonly referred to in those publications as inclusive engagement. And the existing guidance pointed to 4 considerations or broad areas of action for regulators to incorporate engagement with the full range of consumers, including consumers experiencing vulnerability. So I'll talk you through those now. The first is about developing an organisational culture of inclusive, diverse and representative engagement. And there are 2 elements of this. One is establishing engagement with the full diversity of consumers as a standard practice, rather than adding on engagement with consumers experiencing vulnerability or other groups as a separate process to mainstream or usual stakeholder engagement. And this doesn't mean engaging with everyone on every subject every time. It's more about establishing so-called vulnerability issues as core consumer matters and getting away from this tendency to differentiate between standard and non-standard consumers and processes for engaging with them. A second element of these changes to organisational culture is about allocating the necessary resources for implementing this kind of engagement, and that involves things like training, having a dedicated person or team, and developing information sharing networks to build capability within and across organisations. Sitting below this, the second consideration that we found in the existing guidance was understanding why consumer engagement is needed and what approach to take. And the idea here is that consumer engagement will be inclusive and effective if regulators begin with a clear purpose and plan for engagement and then communicate that to participants so that everyone knows what to expect. And here we identify some existing tools that might assist regulators to think about the implications of regulatory policy and processes for different consumers and to decide what input is necessary and appropriate from consumers. So whether, for instance, it's about getting a better idea about the implications of a service or policy for consumers, or about getting consumer input into policy solutions, for instance. We also highlight tools for designing engagement activities depending on the level of influence that consumers will have over the outcome. And then again, going to a more focused consideration, number 3, is actually identifying and reaching consumers for engagement. And this includes identifying individual consumers for direct engagement, rather than only relying on the very important but necessarily filtered input of organisations that work with and advocate for consumers. And here we highlight the importance of direct engagement with consumers, particularly with regard to vulnerability. It's an essential part of understanding vulnerability and promoting the interests of the diverse and dynamic group of consumers who might experience vulnerability on one or more dimensions. And so direct engagement, for instance, gives regulators access to information that might not be held by consumer organisations. It demonstrates respect for individuals' experiences and perspectives, and it ensures that samples of consumers are diverse and representative. And again, we identify here some tools to assist with these processes, including stakeholder mapping exercises, relationship building approaches, and other approaches to working out who to engage with and how, and particularly overcoming some of the barriers to engaging with consumers experiencing vulnerability or groups who tend to be excluded from engagement processes. And then the fourth and final area for consideration narrows in further again onto how you actually design and conduct inclusive engagement activities. And this is all about how to tailor engagement to the people and communities involved. And here we cover a wide range of matters, including disability-related accessibility, social and cultural considerations, language, literacy and digital literacy considerations, and also other things like the impacts of trauma and family violence, and the impacts of environmental and health crises, such as bushfires and pandemics that I mentioned earlier. And we really identify two elements in designing inclusive and universal engagement activities. The first is about designing any activity to be available and accessible to as many people as possible. So for instance, picking venues with good disability accessibility. And then secondly, always asking prospective participants what they need and then tailoring processes accordingly. And to sort of break down the large volume of guidance and information that's available here, we've developed a couple of checklists that really set out the key considerations, looking at three different stages of engagement. And so I'll put up some examples from those checklists now. So the first checklist is preparing for consumer engagement, so prior to the activity. And this covers things like asking individuals and groups how they would like to be engaged. So research and planning, using available guidance that's published by community groups. Secondly, using language that reflects how the community sees themselves. Thirdly, clearly defining the scope and purpose of engagement, and then developing clear and easy to understand explanations and terms of engagement. The importance of asking participants about access to resources that they require to participate. Providing clear and accessible information, both written and in person-to-person communication, and understanding and addressing cultural considerations in partnership with the local community. The second checklist is about actually designing inclusive engagement activities, which covers things like offering multiple opportunities to participate and selecting appropriate engagement tools, helping participants to prepare for what will happen and what's expected of them, choosing locations and venues that are comfortable, familiar and accessible, building accessibility for people with disability into all aspects of engagement, ensuring accessibility to physical venues used for engagement activities and the accessibility of the activities themselves, and we go into more detail about what that means, and then ensuring that facilitation or group management follows principles like openness, being non-judgmental, respectful and flexible. And then the last checklist is about after engagement, so using, reporting and evaluating consumers' contributions. So this is about asking participants during the process whether they would like to receive feedback and how, following up on this by giving feedback on what was discussed and how the feedback was used, considering running community feedback sessions as an appropriate way to discuss the process and outcomes, and then having evaluation processes, including seeking feedback from participants, reflecting on the inclusivity of activities and the ability to be responsive to feedback during the process, and then considering wider community engagement and sharing experiences and reflections with colleagues.
So all of the research we did and the guidance that we looked at led us to propose 10 principles. And these are obviously underpinning all the considerations that we also, and checklists that we've provided in the report that Yvette has just taken you through. So in the report, this is in section 5, and each principle has a headline, is described in a way that gives you the headline issue or the key point for consideration. And then we, in the report, we detail more information about how you can put that into practice, or some examples, and refer back to the checklist. We also did some work for the Commission identifying a pathway of actions and functions that build on their existing strategies and processes. For example, their existing stakeholder engagement framework to assist them to implement the principles. So we've described these principles as universal engagement principles, and we've used this terminology of universal principles alongside the more commonly used concept of inclusive engagement. And this idea of, from the term universal, really refers to the processes being designed from the very beginning with all potential participants in mind, rather than having a stream of engagement and then having an add-on approach for some categories or groups of people as extras. So, and the principles move from high-level considerations first, and then they sort of follow that same pathway that the considerations do. And I only have time to touch on maybe one or two in more detail by way of example, but I'll just go through them now. So the first principle is to be inclusive, and this is about adapting your standard engagement processes to include all consumers and to develop engagement techniques that are suitable for the diverse characteristics and needs of consumers. The second is to collaborate and co-design with consumers. And this is about developing engagement strategies, plans and techniques in consultation, partnership, or co-designed with consumers. The third is to treat engagement as an ongoing process based on relationships. And this is about investing in relationships with consumers directly, as well as other forms of relationship building with consumer groups and advocates. And this is about building a strong foundation that you can then tap into for engagement. Number 4 is to have a clear purpose, to understand and to clearly explain why you want to engage with consumers. And this is important in terms of that core business, that both the regulator or the regulated business, for example, has a common understanding within their organisation, and they can explain that to the people that they're engaging with. And this is about understanding why consumer engagement is necessary, what information participants need, and what input and influence they might have on the outcomes, what successful engagement looks like, and the implications of these considerations for who is engaged. And in the report, we identify some practical tools that people could use to do this. So number 5 is to reflect community diversity. And this is about representativeness of the information that you're relying on, and making sure you have a diverse range of perspectives. So Principle 6 is about investing in engagement, and that it's both time and resources that are needed for effective and inclusive engagement. Principle 7 is to be transparent and to offer genuine involvement. And this comes back to these ideas about accountability and transparency and legitimacy, to give all participants a genuine opportunity to influence outcomes and equal access to decision makers. And it's also about acknowledging and recognising consumers' contributions. Principle 8 is to show respect for individuals, their knowledge and experience. That's fairly self-explanatory. Principle 9 is to use methods that are universal and flexible. And this comes into the design and planning of engagement, keeping that diversity of consumers in mind, and then asking participants what they need to be able to participate and to tailor activities accordingly. And finally, Principle 10 is to reflect, adapt and improve. And this is that sort of after engagement activity, to invite and act on feedback from engagement participants and implement that and follow up on that, and then also evaluate your activities and adapt and change to continuously improve those in the future. And as I mentioned, we developed a pathway for the Essential Services Commission to look at their current structures and processes and how these principles could be used to make adjustments.
We'll leave it there. There's a lot more details in the report, but we've attempted to make it as user-friendly as possible by including a shorter summary at the beginning, which includes key points from each section and includes the checklists. I know we had a question about that. They're set out at the start of the report and also at the relevant point within the report. So hopefully that's a useful place to start. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great, thanks very much, Yvette and Nina, for your presentation and the work you've done in developing this piece of research. You've really highlighted to me the benefits of directly engaging with consumers, getting their input into policy and other decisions. Also the importance of being alive to the diversity of consumer experiences and to tailor engagement to suit a diverse range of consumers who are experiencing vulnerability, particularly as a regulator of essential services. So this is really exciting work for us to consider at the Commission. I'm sure others feel the same way around the virtual table today. And I guess your universal engagement principles really provide us with a valuable opportunity to build on our stakeholder engagement framework, which when it was developed back in 2018 was a real attempt to set a new benchmark for regulators in how we went about engaging with consumers. So thank you very much. I would like now to open up for any questions people might have for Yvette and Nina on this work, and there's the ability to do that on Slido, as I mentioned before, and there will be a panel discussion with Yvette and Nina later in the webinar too. Yvette and Nina, I think there is one question I've seen pop up on Slido, so maybe I'll leave it to you to have a look at that, or would you like me to read it out?
I've had a couple come through here that I can have a go at to start us off. The first one is about the project being focused on regulators and whether there are lessons for businesses consulting on projects like new transmission lines or water pricing. And we certainly did focus in this project on regulators' engagement with consumers specifically. We started to look at regulated businesses as well and realised that that was a separate project. There's obviously a lot of overlap here, and I think particularly in terms of the detailed guidance that we've tried to offer in terms of how to make engagement activities universally available, will have a wider application. But there's certainly, it does mean that there are a lot of other things that we would have loved to have included in the report in terms of good practice and so on that's happening at the business level, but certainly lots of similar lessons, I think. And also we discuss a little bit in the report, which might be of interest, the role of regulators in facilitating engagement directly between regulated businesses and consumers, which is certainly a big focus in the area as well. And then a couple of other questions about the availability of the slides from today. We're certainly happy for those to be shared with everyone, and the checklists, just confirming that those will be available in the report as well. And I can see a couple of others here. The engagement principles seem to be useful not just for consumers, but also in how the ESC engages with industry stakeholders. Is there any thought to apply these types of principles to all stakeholders? That's another really good question. Nina, feel free to chime in so that I'm not the only talking head on this, but certainly the idea here is that this is about accessibility and availability for everyone. And again, our advice about amending existing engagement frameworks is really about that point, that this is, this is core business and this is useful for everyone and for every process rather than specifically on these vulnerability questions.
I was just going to add that it might be, for whoever's asked that question, interest to read the section in the report about where we try and amass a whole lot of information about this idea of the concept of regulation and how that ideas around that have changed over time, and that, this broader idea of looking at who your stakeholders are and diversity in industry stakeholders is a really interesting sort of point to come out of that too, that it's not just consumers who maybe we're thinking about in different ways. So hopefully you'll find that section useful.
Thanks very much, Yvette and Nina. I can actually see a number 4 question there too, which is a nice one to see, just mentioning that we do have a very good stakeholder engagement framework that we've done a lot of work on, and the manager of Stratcoms, Michelle Bryan, would be very happy to see that comment there. But, how can we, use this work to add to our framework? Well, I guess my response to that is it's never a set and forget. There are always new things to be learning and taking on board, particularly as we learn more from the research that Yvette and Nina have done. So we will turn our mind to that and work very closely with Michelle to see what we can do next. I wonder at this point, it is 3:36. Do we have time for one more question, Yvette and Nina? There's one more that has just popped in, and then we might move on to the next session.
Sure. So a question here about whether we investigated or benchmarked against other public sector industries. And our questioner is in healthcare, and they're a long way down the road in consumer engagement. That's another area that we started looking at. And again, it would have required another 4 reports. I agree with you that approaches have been quite different, and that there is a lot to learn. We certainly noticed overlap in the sense that a lot of the background knowledge and information that we find in the inclusive engagement literature has developed in the healthcare space, or has been influenced to some degree in that space. And I think it would be really useful if we could in the future facilitate dialogues across these sectors, because there's already so much knowledge and expertise there.
Just to add to that, the other area that we were very aware of, but we would have loved to have brought into the report more in terms of other policy areas was, and this sort of goes into more of the area of research in some aspects, but if, for example, in the area of the justice system, where that sort of consumer or community perspective has been an area of focus in the last few years. That's a lot of my background. So that's another sort of interesting, I guess, side policy area to look at in terms of, deliberative processes, particularly like citizens' juries and things like that.
Thanks very much, Yvette and Nina. Really informative presentation, and I'm sure there'll be some more questions later in the webinar today. So thank you. We might move on now to the second part of today's webinar, which are insights from our deliberative community panel from the process to the recommendations. Before I hand over, as it were, to our community panel members on a video, I'd like to give some background for those who are new to this work. The community panel was designed to engage directly with consumers from across Victoria. It was done in partnership with Mendelson Consulting, and that panel has been a vital part of our work in the last year. We had 38 Victorians participate in the panel. Following weeks of work with Nicola and Desley from Mendelson Consulting, the panel participants provide us with 8 recommendations to be considered when writing our strategy, and you'll hear a bit more about that from Desley in our panel discussion. I'll just hand over now to our panel members giving their own reflections on the process via video.
I'm Diana Lawrence, and I'm speaking from a little village called Tarrington, which is 5 kilometres or so out from a main town called Hamilton. I live on 4 acres with a few of my breeding horses and a little dog. I was widowed 2 years ago, losing my husband to pancreatic cancer, and I survive on the age pension. I should say I manage very well on the age pension. I have never done a Zoom meeting in my life. Even to download it was stress plus. But it's enriched my life, to be able to mix with the other panel members. And I'm in awe of the presentation of some of them. I think, oh, wow, I could never do that. But I feel very proud to have been selected, and, and I'm very proud that I've been able to contribute in a little way. I thought I'd be sitting here like on mute, but I've been able to, put in and share. So for that, I thank you.
Moving forward, it would be wonderful to have the panel updated. A few of the panel members have spoken about how friends and family that they've spoken with during this exercise. There's a spectrum there's a spectrum of people thinking that there will be some positive outcomes and actual changes made to better support vulnerable community members. And then there's the pessimists or the critics that kind of say, look, you know, all talk, no action. It'll be interesting to see how much action is actually delivered, measured and reported on. So I think going forward, that measurement is really important, and regular promotion and key messaging of the deliverables that are put in place for the vulnerable community members in Victoria as part of this strategy from the ESC is celebrated widely and proudly.
My name's John Conliffe. I've just retired. I've been just retired a year, and I come from Kyneton. I was very sceptical. I got phoned up by a bloke called Greg and from the ESC, and I thought here's another scam call. But he soon put my mind at rest. I was actually going fishing, so maybe he caught me at a weak point, and he said, "Oh, you going this?" "Oh, yeah, okay." Because my mother was widowed when I was 7. Had a pretty hard upbringing with 4 children, and so I was interested from the start. So that was good. And then I got a call from Desley, and I was out fishing. So I thought, well, there's a seam running through this. So Desley spoke me through, and she said, "You've been chosen." I said, "Thank God, I've just been chosen. I caught this big fish, so I must be." Yeah, it was great. Desley and Nicola and the rest of the ESC team have been very professional. And I was very sceptical because I thought 38 people on a Zoom chat is be like herding chickens. So, but they've done it very well. And this panel is, most of the people I meet in life and most of the people you meet in life are like rolling stones. They just roll along the river, you know, da, 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 da. But this panel has got some diamonds in it. And what I mean by that is they stand up, they don't go with the flow, and they cut through. So they're not, so that's why your recommendations are fairly strong. And at the same time, it's been a very respectful conversation. The other thing it did for me is it gave me a vehicle to talk to my friends and family about vulnerability and well-being, and the process continued in my mind. I was always thinking about it, or when I'd go to bed, or odd times, or when I was out fishing and it was quiet, I'd be thinking about it. So it gave me permission to talk and to think about things that probably you don't normally think about, or you don't normally go to. And it gave some of my family and friends also permission to talk and think. And I think that was important. And I think bringing that along to a group was very, talking about vulnerability, you could open up your vulnerabilities, and you didn't feel like you were being judged. You felt you were being accepted, as Diana said. She felt accepted, and that was great. There's a great diversity in this thing.
Just wouldn't mind saying, I actually think a really powerful part of this process has actually been the direct involvement of the ESC representatives. I must admit, I was expecting a lot more grey cardy sort of representation, and I think you were really good in terms of just being pragmatic, to the point, open. You helped direct us a bit, and I think that gave the whole process more credibility and gave us more confidence in, you know, how authentic your engagement is in this activity, and that you are taking it seriously. So it's going to be really interesting to hear and see how this gets taken forward. But thanks for, you know, thanks for just being very, very genuine with us. I think it's been really valuable.
That's great. I hope everyone enjoyed just getting a sense of the 38 Victorians that worked with us. And I think Jen at the end there really summed it up for me. This process wasn't about having a brigade of grey cardigans providing predictable advice or views that aligned perfectly with our own. We wanted to be challenged, and most importantly, we wanted to hear the voices and better understand the experiences of a diverse range of Victorians. The diversity of perspectives in the room was so important to the community panel work, and to me personally as well. The time, insight and effort that panellists brought to the panel was absolutely fantastic. With engagement work like this, you can certainly run the risk of people joining who are not engaged with the work. When I welcomed the panel at their first online meeting alongside Simon, it occurred to me what a pivotal and important point it was to have 38 Victorians giving us their time and to share their reflections. And I must admit that my response to that moment took me a bit by surprise, with an emotional expression of my appreciation to the panel. And what I would say really stood out about this work was the effort that all the panellists then put in throughout their meetings. I'd also like to acknowledge that the last panel sessions did feel rushed for many of the participants, and one of our key takeaways, and one I would recommend to all of you here today, is to ensure that you provide engagement events like this one with enough time, not just for the framing at the start, but for the wrapping up at the end. I'd also like to take this opportunity to share with you some of the key themes we heard throughout the process. They were around improving communications, which was identified by the panel as vital to addressing consumer vulnerability, including making bills more accessible. Improving empathetic timing and communication, something we have also heard in our roundtables throughout 2020 and again start of this year. That we need to continue to raise awareness of what help is available, as people are still not aware of where they can go for information or support. That's a real critical one. And more collaboration between regulators, industry and consumer organisations to address the systemic barriers consumers experiencing vulnerability face when they seek that support. The panel also recommended that we look into the term vulnerability and reassess whether this is the right term for our work, and we are currently giving this some further careful consideration, in fact, in a meeting just earlier today with commissioners. And as I said earlier, the work done by the community panel has been vital in building our consumer vulnerability strategy. It will help us make sure we are continuing to look out for and protect the long-term interests of Victorians. On that note, I'll now hand over to my fellow Commissioner Simon Corden. Simon, thank you for facilitating our panel discussion today, which I'm looking forward to.
Well, thanks, Kate, and thank you again to everyone attending today. Before we get into this quite exciting panel, I just want to echo Kate and acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands I am working on today, the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of various lands you are working on and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating today. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and elders from other communities who may be here today. I'd like to start with my own reflections on the work of the community panel and how disappointed I am that I'm not wearing a grey cardigan for this discussion. As the lead commissioner for the vulnerability strategy, I found the enthusiasm of the panel inspiring. I admit I was nervous about using Zoom for this work because we wanted to get such a diverse group of people, but as you saw, that's what we achieved with Diana and Conan and John and Jennifer. But I think we all learnt a lot of patience over the last year of working with technology, and are probably all sick of hearing you're on mute, but they were fantastic, the panellists, in terms of how they worked through the challenges of the technology, and they provided such informed and thoughtful recommendations that we've received from the panel have allayed any fears that we had about how the technology would work. In some ways, you know, if we'd done this a year ago, pre-COVID, it would have been in many ways quite a different challenge, because we got people from right across Victoria, from, as you heard, regional areas with very different experience. Suggestions on how we could do this work better in the future was so useful for us to think through, and we've worked hard to make sure that these recommendations from the panel are taken into account in the draft strategy. And I'd like to encourage everyone here to look at the draft strategy when it's released, give feedback and attend workshops we'll hold to hear your views on the content of the draft when it's released in April. So we're now going to move to into our panel discussion. If you can ask questions on Slido, that will be helpful, because you can or vote questions that you see others have asked that you'd like. That would be really helpful. So onto our panel discussion. Today we have Yvette, Nina and Desley Renton. While you've already met Yvette and Nina, I'll introduce Desley. Desley was one of the consultants from Mendelson Consulting who led our community panel. Thank you for being here today. So the first question I'll ask of you, the panel, is in your experience, what do you see the role of the regulator being in promoting and supporting best practice engagement? Perhaps Yvette and Nina, in the paper you outline the role of the Commission specifically. Are there key points that could be transferred to other regulators?
Thanks, Simon. I'll have a go at that one. In the report, we tried to focus quite broadly on the role of regulators, particularly regulators of essential services, and then also looked at guidance on community and consumer engagement more generally again. So we certainly intended the discussion of guidance and principles for future action to be useful more broadly for other regulators. And as I mentioned before, certainly elements of it for regulated businesses and others engaging with consumers. Like I said, there's lots of work on engagement in other spaces, which I think could be really useful here as well. But certainly we tried to be broad, and as Nina mentioned, these are really rationales for regulator engagement quite broadly. But with that being said, and following on from a question we had earlier, we did look specifically at the Commission's role in terms of its objective and roles set out in the governing legislation about promoting the interests of consumers and having regard to the benefits and costs of regulation to consumers generally, but specifically low-income and vulnerable consumers is in the Act. And then we looked at really how the principles would apply to the Commission's existing stakeholder engagement framework. And we've got an appendix in the report that looks at that, so really holds up the framework against the principles that we developed and finds that a lot of the key themes are already in that framework. And it's really things like transparency, accountability, inclusiveness, accessibility of information are all in there. And it's really about using the more detailed information that we've come up with in this report to perhaps augment or develop those further.
Fantastic, thanks Yvette. Might ask you this question, Nina, I'm not sure if you're the best person to answer this one, but we've got a question on what extent do you think language impacts the way institutions consider who has the relevant knowledge and experience to share? And someone wondered whether we should be moving towards calling everybody a stakeholder, industry and otherwise. I wondered if you had any comments on that, the language issue.
Sure. Just looking at the question. So I'm going to answer this thing. It's talking about language in what we call, who we call a consumer and who we call a stakeholder. Yep,
and it's a question who they think's got the relevant knowledge.
Yeah, well, I think that I guess going back to the idea of what we were talking about before with consumer engagement, and that we're talking about anyone who is who could be affected by a regulatory decision or has an interest in a regulatory decision or be impacted by it. And obviously that relates to both individuals as well as more what are traditionally called stakeholders, industry and professional stakeholders. So I think language is important because there is that tendency to think of consumers as individuals, one person in the community, and businesses as sort of being slightly different. And I think it's also the idea of who the community is also an interesting idea in terms of language, because the community of people could include both individuals and the businesses that are working in those communities. And I think that also comes down to, I guess, how the culture within an organisation and how they're talking about using the language to talk about these different people who are involved. And again, it's sort of that starts from that internal cultural positioning that people are taking.
Okay, no, interesting. Desley, I wonder if you could add something. There's another sort of perspective on language. I know the community panel had some views on the use of the word vulnerable in terms of consumers. Did you want to share what you heard from the panel?
Thank you very much, Simon. And as has been pointed out, we had a fantastic panel in terms of diversity and lived experience. We certainly had people who brought their own experience of vulnerability into the room as well. And for different people, it meant different things. In fact, this was quite a philosophical conversation throughout the life of the panel. Some people saw vulnerability in some aspects as being a positive thing in some ways. There was a lot of grappling around whether this was the right term in this particular context, and some of the suggestions were around hardship, for example, in recognition that people are not always vulnerable. I think it's number 6 as a recommendation that there was actually not enough time to come up with the best terminology or the best language in the group, and that there did need to be deeper thinking and a broader conversation to actually nail that particular recommendation.
I think the discussion I sat in on, there's certainly unease about using the term vulnerability in terms of how it could exclude some people who didn't think of themselves as vulnerable, even though they recognised they needed support. So it was a really rich discussion on that topic.
And for some people in a cultural context, there could potentially be a stigma around identifying in that way as well.
Okay, great. We had a question about suggestions for effectively engaging diverse consumers in a COVID-safe way. The barriers to participating in most online activities are high. And the questioner asked about they've been grappling with engaging with diverse customers via these channels. I might get you, Desley, to answer that first, and then Yvette or Nina, if you've got any observations on that. But Desley, it was the middle of the lockdown, I think, where we're doing a lot of this work.
That's quite right. And typically a deliberative engagement process, which for those of you who are familiar with the International Association for Public Participation, or IAP2, the deliberative process sits towards the end of the spectrum in a collaboration empower pillar. You would typically do those things face-to-face over a fairly long period of time. The elements of those processes requiring deep thinking, exposure to good quality information, opportunities to debate and discuss and deliberate. Of course, we couldn't do any of that. So we really needed to design the process online in a way that was going to deliver the depth of experience for people and facilitate the conversations. A couple of elements that we included to support that were breaking people into regions and areas. So we started the discussions quite small with people who lived rurally or regionally in an urban setting, etc. And then literally over a period of time mixed people up so they could cross-fertilise their conversations. We also had numerous other ways of engaging with people between their formal meetings. So we, again, online, we had a private portal where the panel members could speak to each other very candidly, and also to ourselves as facilitators and to the ESC staff too. So, I mean, all of these things were necessary to keep the conversation going and for it to be a meaningful experience for people.
Great, thank you. We had a question about plain language and easy English resources, noting that expertise is hard to come by in Australia, particularly to engage on complex situations in energy sector and water sector, often pretty complex regulatory systems. Yvette, did you have any, did you look at barriers to organisations being able to effectively use these principles? You know, investment is one thing, but access is another, the questioner comments.
Yeah, that's certainly a good point. I think part of that is it's a sort of chicken and egg thing, in the sense that the more demand there is, hopefully that means the more we'll see the availability of these services, because there'll be resources for them to be, you know, there'll be demand for them to be provided. Certainly now, having had experience across a number of projects of working with a number of different organisations in developing easy English materials specifically, there certainly is expertise out there. It's a cost that needs to be factored in early into projects, and particularly also a timing issue, which Kate mentioned as well, in terms of you need to consider these things in the timeline and make sure that they're planned for early enough so that you're publishing all of your versions at the same time and so on, because they do add time, but certainly in terms of expertise and so on, there's a number of organisations out there who do produce these materials. Some of those are disability advocacy organisations, and there you especially get people who use easy English materials, so some people with cognitive disability who can test those materials, be involved in their development, and check them to make sure they are actually accessible. So certainly out there, I think you're right that the challenge is lining all of these things up, but we're seeing scope as well, producing more legal documents in easy English. So I think that expertise is really there in terms of dealing with complexity as well.
Thank you, Yvette. I reflect on, is it Mark Twain who said I was going to write you a short letter, but I didn't have time, so I wrote you a long one. I think the idea of planning enough time to convert what you're producing into the simple and easy English is absolutely a really good point. The next question we had was, some of these consultation processes may uncover issues that are outside the ESC's direct control or influence. And it was asking about process to providing information to government to address these issues through policy changes. I think that was something, Desley, that came out in the community group, wasn't it? In the community panel about the engaging with other parts of government. Do you want to reflect on that?
That's correct. And as Yvette and Nina have pointed out, a key principle of engagement is about being absolutely clear about the remit and what's on the table. However, things will always come up because the panel will raise those interests. In the recommendations that the panel provided, some directly relate to the work of the Essential Services Commission, where others are perhaps more of an advocacy role for the Commission and others. So there certainly is within what they have produced guidance, if you like, or recommendations on how to do that better across the impacted stakeholders, including community organisations as well, and those groups supporting those people who are vulnerable. And collaboration between all those sectors certainly came through very strongly.
Thanks, Desley. Maybe a question for Yvette or Nina. The question we got is consumer engagement is flavour of the month. How do you ensure that those who are doing the engagement approach consumers with empathy as well as talking the talk? Any insights from your work on that challenge?
I guess one reflection on that is what we talk about in the principles and in the report about relationship building, and that it's sort of not just going to the consumers when you want something from them, but about about really investing and being genuine in building relationships with people who not only might want to have a say in what you're doing, but who you actually are relying on to get that information from about how, so you can make good decisions in, say, in the regulation of essential services, making sure that the decisions that are being made are for benefiting consumers or in the interests of consumers. So I think it's sort of thinking about it not just as a one-off, but as an ongoing process. And not just building a relationship so you can then engage with someone, but it sort of should go on after the engagement process is finished as well. So, that's a comment to make on that.
Thanks, Nina. Great point, I think, about relationships rather than transactions, I suppose. But Desley, you wanted to add something to that?
I did. Thank you, Simon. I think it's a really great question, and it highlights the importance for me of the people who are doing the engaging being professionals in it. And it was something that was raised so much by the panel as well, about the experience and knowledge and skills of those they're relating to. So being a professional engagement officer who works to a set of core values and a practice code of ethics, which is something Nicola and I would bring to the table. And I think that is a way of helping to ensure that the engagement is being done well, it's genuine, it's authentic, and is done indeed professionally.
Fantastic. Look, I suppose one of my reflections on this project, since we've launched the work on vulnerability, we're engaging with a different set of stakeholders, a broader set of stakeholders than we might have before, which has been, fantastic to get those more diverse perspectives. These are community groups as well as individuals. So that's really helping enriching our work. I had a question about whether the principles apply to small and large business consumer engagement and participation. Did you want to, Yvette or Nina, talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't see why they wouldn't, I suppose. Again, we've cast them quite broadly. We have been informed, of course, by those specific rationales for regulatory engagement, but there's a lot of overlap there in terms of, particularly for regulated businesses, in terms of their obligations and responsibilities to consumers and so on. And, they're at that level of things like being inclusive, being accessible, being approachable, that I think would certainly apply and could inform your engagement processes and frameworks for a range of organisations. And even at that level of organisational culture change, I think it certainly lends itself across the board too.
A personal reflection on that, a number of the commissioners, we went to the Consumer Action Law Centre to sit in on some of their call centres just to get an understanding of the work they do on the national debt line. And a lot of the callers were very small businesses, and the distinction between a small business and a consumer can be quite indistinct. So, they're people from vulnerable communities who are operating small businesses. So I think there's some real interesting observations there. We had a question about, and this is probably for you, Desley, about how are the panel members identified and recruited so to get an appropriate diverse representation across Victoria. A lot of work I know went into that. Perhaps you could talk about how you achieved that 38 such diverse people.
And as you've heard from one of our panel members, he got a cold call, and we worked in partnership with an organisation called Call Assist, who specialise in the recruitment of groups such as the one we've managed to get together. They contacted 1,000 people from a variety of databases across Victoria, looking for our shortlist of 38. But we used a couple of other methods as well. We did recruit directly through the Engage Vic website, and people reading information about the project would fill out an expression of interest form, which would then go to the Call Assist database. And we also worked with RMIT. Typically in these processes, it's harder to get that younger demographic. So there's not necessarily one magic method for recruitment. You'll find if you look at deliberative work across organisations, there are lots of different ways of doing it. That's how we did the recruitment in this process.
It certainly seems very successful from my perspective. I saw the diversity of and a number of the younger participants, as well as those who are keen on fishing or other parts of the age spectrum, but no, it was fantastic, the group you got. We've got a question about thoughts on engaging consumers on technical matters that impact consumers, but they may seem a bit that they're completely removed from them. I don't know if Yvette or Nina, if you've had any insights into that challenge.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly something that comes up in the sense of the inaccessibility of stakeholder engagement in this context, in the sense that if you are framing, you're immediately excluding certain people from participating in the engagement if you can only or do only frame the question in highly technical terms. And so that sort of comes back to those questions about why you're engaging, what's your purpose, and then what's your purpose with different individuals and groups. And so again, that sort of advice about plain language and easy English and so on. So thinking about framing the question differently for different audiences, depending on what you all want to achieve and so on, I think is a really important part of that. And that comes into that importance of articulating why you're engaging and then being able to communicate that throughout the process.
Yeah, no, I think.
Sorry, I was going to add to that, that I think that being kind of thinking very carefully about how you could design some quite high level engagement activities or engagement questions, or even more of a widespread sort of deliberative discussion panel focus. And so you're not asking consumers specifically about the technical nitty-gritty, but you can then draw on the responses you get from these bigger picture questions and apply them to as sort of a piece of evidence that you then feed into answering these more technical questions, or sort of, you know, whether you use that to draw up a set of principles that you then try and use as the framework for answering the more technical questions. That is another perspective that could be useful in relation to that query.
Fantastic. No, thank you, Nina. We had a question from Debbie. As we are discussing the need to have appropriately skilled engagement officers in place to ensure engagement is effective, what, if any, development training is available to the organisations? Is there an overall skills development approach? I know one of the speakers mentioned the IAPP. Desley, yep, I know that's something that the Commission trains its staff in, and is something that we're very enthusiastic about using that approach. But perhaps, I don't know who's best to address that particular question.
I can, Simon, if you like. Yes, you've mentioned IAP2, who are the industry body for the work of public participation or community engagement globally. The organisation has been around for a long time now and earned its respect over many years, so much so that you'll see it referenced in state government legislation around the country, that people are required in some instances to abide by the foundations of IAP2 to deliver a good practice engagement process that can be properly evaluated. And there is a host of training available through that association that equips people at either a basic level or indeed at a sort of a rich level over a period of time to undertake and evaluate, to plan, deliver and evaluate quality engagement processes.
Right. I had one comment somewhere in the chat that a little bit hard to hear, Desley, so I might need to speak up or turn the volume up, but I think I got most of that. I think we've got most of that. One of the things in that question was the sort of terminology of engagement officers. I suppose we sort of think all of us are engaging with the community in all our various works. So, you know, we take a very broad approach to getting as many people as possible trained up in those techniques. Rather than having a small coterie of engagement officers and the rest of us can sit with our grey cardigans in our offices. So, you know, certainly encourage people to access that training.
And if I can add on to that on the training question, so we talk about a lot of the IAP2 guidance in the report, but we also talk about other areas of training that are likely to be necessary. So it's not only, I mean, training on engagement is obviously central here, but it also has to be training on a range of other things: mental health and disability awareness, family violence awareness, responding to distress, all of those kinds of things. So we sort of include in the report a list of those other kinds of considerations, and that's not necessarily about everyone having the maximum expertise, but it's about understanding who does hold that expertise in the organisation and having people available as appropriate. And then also knowing, coming back to that point about empathetic engagement, knowing when you have the expertise in-house and when you need to go outside to engage engagement experts, and also experts by experience. So if you're running an engagement for people with disability, the importance and value of having advocates with disability running that as well.
Right, that came across so strongly from the panel, who had a very clear understanding of those requirements and have indeed written them into their recommendations.
Fantastic.
Just add another plug to into the report. Sorry, Simon.
The more we want, we up this red.
We also refer to the IAP2 framework, and we've sort of tried to assist readers of the report to use that in a practical way by including some other, I wouldn't say versions of it, but by including 3 levels. So we sort of have the IAP2 spectrum, and then we have the next level of what that looks like in terms of where information is coming and going, and then some examples of how you might actually do that by community engagement activities. And we've drawn on some other resources that refer to the IAP2 framework in doing that. So that might be a useful thing if people are interested in that as well. And we also talk about using partnerships as a way of developing expertise in consumer engagement. So partnering with organisations that have that those relationships or that expertise or that training necessary to be safely engaging with individuals or groups.
Thank you. No, that's really important, and keep plugging the report. We want as many people as possible to read it. It's available free on our website, so download it now. We had, Desley, a couple more questions just about the process of the deliberative panel. In particular, did we provide the technology, internet access and training to the panel members? And secondly, a question about what criteria was used to identify participants. Obviously, a lot of interest about mechanics of making such a successful project work. You're on mute, I think, Desley.
Apologies.
Always a first.
I'll start with the criteria question, Simon, if you don't mind. So we did, in the planning for the community panel, we worked very closely with officers from the Essential Services Commission to seek agreement on who, if you like, we needed to have in the room. And it is a step in the design of around the stakeholder analysis. We knew we needed a diversity of ages, a diversity of location and life experience, gender, obviously, relationship to their essential service provider, people who lived in single households, people who lived in families, people who were renters, people who owned their own home. So we were able to get a lovely microcosm or mini public, if you like, of experiences. I think there were about 13 criterion from which we needed to meet from that group of 1,000 people in the beginning. So there's a lovely process that people go through, and by the time they get that phone call, they're very excited and do feel like they've part of something very special, and motivation levels are always very high, which is why we retain people through the process. The technology was provided by the Essential Services Commission. We did have to train some people one-on-one in the using of that technology, and there was a bit of hand-holding for some people who were very challenged around that. In terms of, I would go online with that person half an hour before each meeting just to make sure they were comfortable. But as you heard Diana say, she was very proud of herself at being able to manage that through the process. The Engage Vic website was also, and the private portal on that was also managed by the wonderful staff within the Essential Services Commission.
Okay, no, I think the mechanics of it are quite challenging, but I think the outcome really paid off in terms of the work that we're able to do with Mendelson Consulting to get that sort of level of engagement. Now, the next question we've got is, just sorry about that. So this is a question, in your experience, what do you see as the role of regulator being in promoting and supporting practice engagement? It's probably for Yvette or Nina.
Yeah, that's a good question. And as I mentioned before, it certainly comes up in the literature that this is one of the key roles for regulators, is not only to be considering their own engagement processes, but also to consider their role in facilitating and incentivising that for regulated businesses. And there, I think that's really a combination of things in terms of leading by example, for one, and also providing guidance that's practical and useful, and establishing these things as indicators of effective regulation and as something that is important. Nina, am I missing anything on that front?
I don't think so, but just to pick up on that idea that was one of the areas that we sort of really would have liked to have looked into more, but weren't able to. That idea of how, for what, this is not the best word to be using, but incentivising sort of regulators providing support to regulated businesses to do more consumer engagement and sort of bringing that into the performance of regulated businesses, or more, for example, asking regulated businesses to, when they're making submissions on pricing, for example, to show evidence that they have brought in experiences and views from consumers. So I guess sort of providing that framework for requiring that consumer voice to be part of the evidence that both regulated businesses are making submissions on, and then also that the regulator itself can factor those into decision making. I think that's probably a really interesting and key area that would be great to write another report on, as Yvette said.
We had an interesting couple of questions which are really for the ESC, it's directed at the ESC, and one of them is, how do we go about identifying when and which projects to engage consumers on? And a related question is, how do you keep the cost of inclusive engagement realistic? I suppose my response to that would be, in almost every project we do, we engage with consumers through a public consultation process. So there's the opportunity for consumers to engage. This project is, and we have forums for usually for industry and community groups. This has been really a focus in part on how do we be more proactive. And I think that is going to be the real challenge for us in terms of doing the work that Desley's team did is quite resource intensive, both in terms of we need external expertise, but also internal resources. So we need to think very carefully about how proactive we are in directly engaging with consumers, and also be mindful that there's a cost imposed on the people we're engaging with. Most community groups will tell you that they're getting engaged, all different parts of government at both state, federal, are coming at them from every direction. So they've got a difficult choice as well. So we've got to focus on a question on engagement fatigue, which is something we need to work through. We've got a lot of questions here, which unfortunately we haven't been able to get to all of them. But the final question I've got for each of the panelists is, do you have any practical tips for people to take away from today? And perhaps I'll start with you, Yvette, apart from, and I know Nina's going to say read your report, but Yvette, if you could kick that off, practical tips.
Well, I can probably start with a similarly glib suggestion that we focus very much in the report on the how question, and we really did a lot of work with the team at the Commission to make this a user-friendly and an implementable document, as it were. So I'd have to start by saying my tip is implement all of the things that we have suggested. But certainly we also characterise this as a process. And so I think probably that initial tip, as it were, is really beginning with this institutional commitment to inclusive engagement that we're seeing with the Commission and in many organisations. And so again, that's about articulating really clearly the role and purpose of engagement generally, and also for specific functions and processes and projects and so on, revisiting engagement strategies to see if and how they might need to be revised or amended. And of course, drawing on your consumer panel or your other bodies and individuals to inform and really guide and ideally lead those processes. And then establishing responsibility internally for this, so that it is a project that is attached to someone's KPIs, for example, to someone's position, that then means that there's that momentum to keep this rolling forward.
Fantastic.
I think Just to add to that, going off the idea of having a strategy and relationship building, which I've talked about a lot as well, but that idea of sort of looking at what you already have in place, and then what else you might need to do long term to allow for not just more empathetic consumer engagement and not just sort of coming along and having a transaction, but actually looking at how you can use that as more of a broader strategy. So you might say, we've got 4 projects coming up over the next 2 years that we really would like to get we need to get some universe, some real broad and diverse views from consumers. So let's think about how we could have a long-term relationship building strategy and link that with an engagement strategy. And you could maybe even be asking participants about a number of things at the same time, rather than sort of running that risk of having consumer participation fatigue. And so I think my sort of tip about what to do practically would to be about look at what you already have in place and some sort of longer term as well as shorter term planning around sort of how you can be more efficient in using the resource that is such a great resource for having individuals provide their experience and views.
Okay, thank you. And finally, Desley.
Thank you. And I echo everything my fellow panellists have said. From a community engagement process point of view, the planning time, we'll talk about the 80-20 rule is essential, and to get that remit that we've talked about and the level of influence that's on the table absolutely crystal clear between the sponsoring body, the Commission, and the facilitators is vital. I think it really came across that we presented as a unified team, and having the involvement of Kate, yourself and Simon and the other commissioners just sent a wonderfully powerful message of integrity and a genuine approach to the panel. So, I mean, in terms of tips for future, I think those sorts of things are really worth looking at.
Thanks, Desley. That's really helpful. And I really thought it was a privilege to be involved, and I know my fellow commissioners did, because all 4 of us were able to participate, as well as our CEO and many of our senior executives, and it was a fantastic experience. We're out of time now, and thank you to Yvette, Nina and Desley for your time today and for answering these questions so comprehensively. I know I got a lot out of your answers, and I hope that other attendees did too. I'll now hand over to Kate to wrap up today's event. So thank you, all of you.
Thanks very much, Simon, Yvette, Nina and Desley, and thanks for all the terrific questions that came from the floor and engaging with our panel in that way. That was fantastic to watch. Certainly been a great opportunity today to hear from engagement experts and for us to provide our reflections on the community panel process. Just on a personal note too, it's been terrific to note the wide range of backgrounds and interests around the virtual table today. Those that are interested in a non-regulated context and across a number of sectors. I've seen planning perspective, a healthcare perspective. So for me, the value of meeting with you all around the virtual table is to share the research from Yvette and Nina, the learnings from our deliberative panel from Desley, and to have the opportunity to cross-pollinate ideas for improvement. So as I mentioned at the start, if there are any questions we didn't get to during the session today, we will try to respond via our wrap-up email in the next few days. In the next coming weeks, we will be also holding a cross-sector workshop to discuss the language of vulnerability with you and hear your views. So please look out for an invitation to that. And as I mentioned earlier, we're now working towards the release of the draft vulnerability strategy in April. It will have a 5-week consultation period with the final strategy set for release on the 30th of June. I'd really strongly recommend you read the draft strategy and get involved in the engagement work that will be done throughout April and May. On that note, and given the time, I will move to close today's webinar, but thank you again to all of our speakers, Yvette, Nina and Desley, my fellow Commissioner Simon for facilitating, and to all of you today for taking the time to attend. Thanks very much and take care. Thanks everyone.